Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be moving on to the next topic in chapter 2, called the Production Possibilities Frontier. This is actually the next model, the third model that we're going to be studying in this class. Remember that the first model was the circular flow diagram in chapter 1, and we learned about the other model, the second model called the budget constraint earlier in this chapter. So what I want to do then is move on to this one, which is very similar to the budget constraint, but it uh, gives an overview of a different idea. So recall that the budget constraint shows that individuals can't have everything due to scarcity, right? Because we all have a limited budget, so we can't buy everything that we might want to have. So whenever we decide to spend money on one thing, that means we have less money remaining to spend on the other thing, right? And that's what the budget constraint uh, had showed us. Now, likewise, if we were to expand that idea outward to society at large, right, we can see the same type of thing happen as well. Society cannot also have everything that it might possibly want to have, because again, just like how there are opportunity costs for us as individuals, whenever we spend money on one thing, we have less money to spend on other things that we might want. Society, if we spend some of our resources, allocate some of our resources to produce more of one good, that means we have fewer resources left over to produce other goods. So let's illustrate this concept using the production possibilities frontier model. So model is production possibilities frontier. Otherwise known as the PPF for short. If you have taken an economics class before this one, um, you might have learned this model, but under a different name called the production possibilities curve instead. Possibilities curve, or PPC. It's just like different terminology for the same thing, and uh, that's fine. It's just like two different terms, but it's referring to exactly the same idea. Uh, So, if you have taken an econ course before and you learned about this either as the PPC, the production possibilities curve, or the production possibilities frontier, the PPF, then this bit might be a good chance for you to review um, some of that stuff that you learned from before. Now, some important things to note, right, before we delve into the model itself is so in the budget constraint, right? Our limiting resource in that case was our budget, right? We only, of course, have a limited amount of money to spend on things. So that was our limited resource that we had to figure out, how we want to use. What about society? Well, society is more limited by, in terms of the things that it can produce, is limited by its available resources for production. Whoops. For production. And in economics, typically what we consider the resources that are required for production, we kind of categorize them into a few different categories. So there are lots of different things that we might need to have in order to produce a good or service. So for example, if we were working at, say, a coffee shop, right? Then of course we know to produce a cup of coffee, like at a coffee shop, there would be lots of different things that we would need. We would need the coffee beans. We would need the machines to, brew the coffee. We would need the cups. Of course, we would need the employees to, be working at the shop to actually brew the cup of coffee. We would need the building itself, right? Because of course the coffee shop needs a place for the shop to actually be. So we would need like a building uh, uh, for for where the shop should be, and all that kind of stuff, right? So we can probably come up with like a list of like 1,000 different things that we would need in order for a coffee shop to be run. But we're not going to be worried about like all the tiny little nuances here, because here we're trying to talk about society at large. And of course, it's not going to be worthwhile to try and list every single thing here that we might need to produce every single good across society, because we're not trying to get to, understand things at that type of level. It's not going to be worthwhile to try and discuss things to that level of nuance when we're just trying to get a general idea of things. Instead, what economists typically do is we categorize those types of resources that we might need to produce all the different types of goods and services that get produced in the country. We categorize them into just a few different categories. The major ones being land, as in the actual like bit of land where, like, say, a coffee shop would be, or any of our businesses might be. Like, for example, if we were running a farm, we will of course need land for the crops to grow. If we were manufacturing things like, say, cars or something, then we would need land for where the factories will be built on, right? So that's what we categorize here as land, for us in economics. We also have labor. This is mostly pretty self-explanatory, right? Of course, for any business to be properly run, we need people working at it, right? Even if we are talking about like a self-owned business where you're like the only person working there, like you or say, for example, let's say you make and draw art, and you sell art, on commissions, for example, then you would be considered like your own labor in that case, right? So even in the smallest like scale types of like businesses or productions, you will still have some amount of labor there. But of course, the bigger you get, the more labor you will need, right? So that's what labor here entails. As a side note as well, this labor category in economics frequently, this also includes the skills of the labor force necessary in order for the business to like properly run, right? So for example, if we're talking about a coffee shop, of course, your employees should know how to brew a cup of coffee, hopefully. They should have good customer service skills. Those types of skills and knowledge are included here under labor, right? So skills, knowledge, education, training, those types of things that the labor needs to properly do their job, that is also included in this category for labor. And the last major category that economists typically include is called capital. Now, capital just refers to all of the manufactured, that is like man-made types of equipment and items that a business will need to use in order to function properly. So again, coffee shop example, that would be, say, the coffee machines. That would include the cups. That would include tables and chairs for the customers to sit at. That would include the building itself as well. So basically, any type of item that a business needs in order to, produce the thing that it's trying to sell, that would be put under the category of capital for economists. So with these three things, we can pretty much categorize any type of specific resource, like in our coffee shop example, the coffee beans, or the employees, or the coffee machines, or the building, or etc. All those things can be put into one of these three camps here, one of these three categories. So that's how we're going to keep things here in this class as well. But to make things even simpler, we are going to make an assumption when we are working with this model, just to make things a little bit easier. Okay. The only resource that we need to worry about at the moment is going to be the amount of labor we have. And this is just for, again, simplification purposes. If we wanted to include these other types of resources in a model, we absolutely can, and we actually will in a way later on. But since this is the first time we are looking at this model, we're going to keep it nice and simple. We're going to just say the only one we need to worry about for right now is labor. Okay, so with that, we'll also need to make a couple more assumptions. So we'll actually need to also assume, again, for the sake of simplicity, there are only two goods, two different goods, that society wants to produce. Now, of course, again, this is a gross oversimplification, but this is similar to uh, the assumption that we made for the budget constraint, where we wanted to say that the only thing that Carol needed to worry about in terms of office supplies was buying copy paper and sticky notes. Um, and that was, if you recall, the reason why we wanted to make that assumption is because when we were drawing that graph, the more goods we wanted to represent there, we would have to add more and more axes onto the graph, right? Now, of course, I'm drawing this on a 2D plane, right? So I can only realistically easily draw two axes on here and have it look nice and neat. So it's the same sort of thing here. If I wanted to include more than two types of goods in this model, we actually can do that, but it's going to be very hard to do that just by drawing it by hand. We would need like a computer to model and draw it for us instead, and that's not really the goal of this class or this lecture. So we're going to keep it simple and say that there's only two types of goods that we want to produce. And last but not least, another assumption that we will be using here, at least at first, is that labor is equally good at producing either product. And basically what I mean by this is, of course, we know that different people have different skills, different training. So for example, I know a lot about economics because I studied it, but I know very little about like chemistry, for example. So while I feel very confident in my skills of like doing things economics related, researching topics in economics, teaching classes in economics, I would be very not confident in my skills if I were asked to do research on a chemistry topic or to teach a chemistry class because I don't I just don't have the skills or the knowledge or the training to do those sorts of things, right? So in practice, of course, we know different people have different skills and knowledge and stuff like that, which makes them, some people better at doing certain types of jobs, making certain types of products compared to others, right? Now, what we'll do is later on, actually, we will be relaxing some of these assumptions to make things a bit more realistic to what things would be like in real life. But for right now, again, since this is our first time looking at this model in this class, keeping it nice and simple. So let's go ahead and put together an example. I'll scroll down here a little bit. Okay, so in this example, there are only two goods, which are smartphone apps and wheat. Now, again, the only resource we need to be worried about is labor. Now, the economy has 50,000 hours per month uh, reserved for production, right? For producing goods and services. Um, that is in total across all of the labor force amongst all the workers. If you add up all the time that they have available to work across the month, that adds up to 50,000 hours. Okay, and producing one app requires 100 hours total. And producing 1 ton of wheat requires 10 hours total. Don't worry too much about these specific numbers. I highly doubt that these numbers are realistic in any type of way. I just wanted to pick two different numbers to make the math, work out in kind of the way that I want to. So, again, just made these numbers up. They don't necessarily have to be realistic for our example here. Okay, so in order to construct our PPF or PPC, once again, we'll be taking a look at it as a graph. And the way that we want to draw our graph then is to first get the total maximum number of each good that we can produce, right? So just like in our budget constraint, um, what we started with was calculating, well, what if Carol spent her entire budget on copy paper? And what if she spent her entire budget on sticky notes? How much of each could she buy in those two cases? Same thing here. So the max amount or number of apps we can produce would be the 50,000 hours we have in total, right? Divided by the 100 hours it takes to make each app, right? So, of course, that gets us to 500 apps produced. And the max number of tons of wheat, is the 50,000 hours we have total each month, divided by the 10 hours per ton. So that becomes 5,000 tons available. Right? So from here, let's go ahead and get our graph started. I'll go through this a bit more quickly since it functions very similarly to how it worked in our budget constraint example. So here on the x-axis, I'll go ahead and write down apps. On the y-axis, I will write down wheat. No, apps. There we go. Okay, and I'll just mark, let's see, this right here as the maximum amount of wheat we can produce. And let's say right here is the maximum amount of apps we can produce. And then to represent all the other combinations, right? Again, this is just if we spend all of our hours on just apps or all of our hours on just wheat. Well, there are other possible combinations. For example, what if we spent half our time making apps and the other half making wheat? 3/4 time spent on apps and 1/4 of the time spent on wheat, and so on and so forth, right? And to represent all those other possible combinations, draw a line, and there we go. Those are all the other possible combinations of wheat and apps that we can make, depending on how much time we spend on each of them. Now, as before, with the budget constraint, points directly on the PPF, that is directly on this line, indicate that we are using all of our available resources. So recall on the budget constraint, if Carol picked a point directly on her budget constraint line, that would indicate that she is spending all of her budget on some combination of sticky notes and copy paper. It's the same type of idea here. We are using all of our resources, in this case labor, in order to produce some combination of apps, smartphone apps, and wheat. So on a PPF, this is in particular given a specific name called productive efficiency. Whoops, let's try and clean that up a little bit. Productive efficiency. And again, basically that just means that we are utilizing all of our resources to the fullest. And this is represented by all the points directly on the line. Represented by the points on the PPF. So any of these points are considered productively efficient. Whether we pick a point, say, all the way down here, where we are using all of our resources just to develop apps, or whether we're all the way up here, where we're using all of our resources just to grow wheat. Both of those points, as well as any other point directly on this line, are considered efficient from a productive point of view, because the only thing that this terminology, this definition checks for is making sure we are using all of our resources to the fullest extent, which basically just means, do we have any leftover labor, for example, not doing anything, not producing either of these goods? And if the answer to that is no, then we are being efficient from a productive point of view anyway. Now, as before as well, points that are directly below this line, like on the budget constraint, points directly below this indicate that we are not being efficient. We are not using all of our resources. So in the budget constraint scenario, that meant Carol was not spending her entire budget. She had some budget left over, which was, not being used to uh, uh, buy those office supplies. It's the same thing here. If we took a point, say down here, this point, let's call this point A, that point would indicate that uh, we have some people who are not producing wheat or apps. So this could be a situation where people are unemployed, for example. Since they are unemployed, they are not producing either of these two goods. And so we are down here instead of being on the PPF itself. And the unemployment can happen for lots of different reasons. The obvious pertinent one here, of course, is due to the pandemic, but lots of other reasons as well. Whether that's just because, certain businesses are downsizing, laying off workers because of poor economic conditions, say due to a pandemic, but also other reasons due to, say, a financial crash, due to a stock market crash. Lots of different reasons why all these things can happen, which are beyond um, the control of the individuals who were, of course, laid off. Now, in contrast, a point up here, let's say point B. Oh, point B. There we go. Points above the PPF, just like on the budget constraint, indicate that we don't have enough resources to achieve that level of goods. So recall with Carol's example with a budget constraint, points above the line meant that she doesn't have enough money in her budget in order to afford that much copy paper and that much sticky notes. Well, here we just don't have enough labor in order to produce this amount of wheat and apps, right? So any points directly above the line are not attainable. They are not achievable. Now, I'm going to clean this up a little bit. What if instead of the idea of efficiency here, of just utilizing our resources to, the fullest, what if we were concerned about, well, what do people actually want to have, right? So naturally, it makes sense that we would probably want a combination of both wheat and apps, right? Because of course, from a societal point of view, everyone needs to eat, so we will need to grow some amount of wheat, of course, but also we use lots of different types of apps, whether for work or for hobbies or, social aspects of our lives. And of course, we want to, have those available to engage with as well. So we will want some amount of apps as well. So uh, we also need to consider not just what's possible, right, for us to produce. We also want to consider um, what is going to be overall best for society. Um, and that term is called allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency. This is just referring to the combination of goods that will be the best overall for society, right? So here are all the different possible combinations of what we can produce using all of our resources. Those are all considered to be productively efficient, but what it means to be allocatively efficient means choosing the one hypothetical, theoretical combination of wheat and apps that will be overall the best for society. So hypothetically, right, there should be one combination somewhere on this line that provides the most value or happiness or utility to society overall. And that would be what is considered allocatively efficient. So just as a quick reminder, right, that deals with some of the ideas talked about in the previous video about utility, right? Just as with a budget constraint, people will choose the combination of goods that will give them the most utility, that will make them overall the most happy. It's the same thing here, except now we're expanding it out to a societal level. There should be some combination of goods here that theoretically will bring the most amount of utility or the most amount of happiness to the most amount of people in society. And that would be the ideal combination of goods that we want. So just to make sure that's clear, one, oh, whoops, one theoretical point on the PPF. Now, of course, different people have different ideas of what is, the best overall for society. Economists may say one thing, philosophers might say another thing, sociologists might say a third thing, and so on and so forth, right? So there can be debate about which one is the best, but at least in theory, there should be one somewhere along this line that brings the most amount of utility overall to society. Now, what would happen if we got some different numbers to work with for our PPF? So if you recall, we looked at Carol's budget constraint and we said, well, what if her budget increased? What if her budget got smaller? And what if the price of one of the goods that she wanted to buy increased? What if the price of sticky notes increased? What if the price of sticky notes decreased? What would happen to the budget constraint? Well, let's ask those same questions here on the PPF. But since we already, analyzed those questions for the budget constraint, and since the answers to those questions work out very similarly here on the PPF, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We're going to kind of like quickly just go through here. So if the if, for example, our nation got more labor to work with to produce more wheat and more apps, let's say we see more workers come into the country because of immigration, for example, then naturally, because we have access to more workers and therefore also more labor, we should be able to produce more stuff. So the line for the PPF should move parallel outward like this, right? And that is with more workers. So that's more labor there in the blue. Now, in contrast, if people left the country, then it would just be the opposite. We would have fewer workers to work with, and so the line would shift inward instead, right? So less labor. Hopefully that all makes sense. It works out, for the same logic and reasons that we talked about with regards to the budget constraint, right? Of course, if we have more labor, we can produce more stuff, so the line shifts outward to represent that fact. If we get less labor, line shifts inward to represent the fact that we can't produce as much as we could before. Now, down here, I just scrolled down a bit and copied the PPF from before. So this is the same base PPF that we drew from the start. But what I want to do now is take this graph and show, well, what would happen if, say, we developed a new technique to grow wheat that makes it much easier to grow wheat compared to before. Well, in this case, then that means, of course, we need less labor in order to grow each ton of wheat. And so the line will pivot outward like this. So the start point or the end point of the line on the y-axis pivots outward, but since this is a new technique that just affects, how much wheat we can grow, how much time it takes to grow wheat, then the line still connects here at the same point where it did before on the x-axis. Because the amount of apps that we can develop is not changed, right? We learned a technique for how to grow wheat in less time, but that doesn't affect how many apps that we can develop. So that's why it still crosses down here, just like with the budget constraint, when the price of sticky notes decreases, right? The line pivoted outward. Well, it's the same thing here. The price of producing wheat, that is the amount of time it takes to produce a ton of wheat, decreased, and so it pivots outward. The PPF pivots outward. Now, if somehow we became worse at growing wheat, so now it takes more time to grow wheat compared to before, let's say maybe the soil quality has gone down, or maybe due to like some bad weather patterns, it's become harder and harder to grow wheat, so it takes more time to grow a ton of wheat. Well, then just the opposite would happen. Here, I'll do this in the green. Then the maximum amount of wheat that we can grow shrinks, right? So this green point here then represents the new maximum amount of wheat that we can grow. But of course, that doesn't affect the amount of apps that we can develop. So it crosses still at the same point. So depending on what is happening, we can pivot the line in or outward here on the y-axis, because depending on the event, depending on the type of situation we're considering, the amount of time it takes to grow wheat can change. It can decrease, in which case it pivots outward here on the blue line, or it can increase. The amount of time to grow wheat can increase, in which case the PPF will pivot inward on the y-axis, here on the green instead. So let me just write that out. Less time to grow wheat. And in the green, that's more time to grow wheat. Actually, just to make sure that's clear, I should probably rewrite that. So less time to grow. Let me actually write it like this. Time needed to grow wheat decreases. Yeah, I'm just rephrasing it a little bit because I realized that the way I phrased it made it kind of sound like, oh, we now have more time to grow wheat. That's not what I mean. What I mean here is for the blue line, the time needed to grow each individual ton of wheat, that's gone down. And for the green line, the time needed to grow wheat has increased. Okay, so hopefully that helps make that really clear what I mean. Okay, but I think that will do it for PPFs for today. We'll actually be continuing more on PPFs next time in the next video. So I will see you then.